I don't remember where we were going, but the whole family was in the car. So the kids were in the back, Emma and Liam. Emma was 6, Liam was 4. Marianne was in the front seat with me. We were driving along, and our trip was interrupted by flashing blue and red lights in the rearview mirror. And I'm pretty sure none of you have ever experienced anything like this, but sometimes peace officers like to pull cars over just to tell them to have a nice day. That's why. Now, if you've experienced anything like this, and I know none of you have, but what happens is the officer will come to your door and you roll down your window and he's going to ask you for your license and your registration. He may say some nice things as well, but that's what happened in this situation. I'm sitting there and my hands are on the wheel and he comes and he says, can I have your license and registration? And as soon as the officer appeared at the window, Liam, who's 4, in the back says, Dad, Dad, Dad. And I'm kind of the dad wave thing, right? Not now, son. He's like, Dad, Dad. I'm like, so I turn around, Liam, not now. Okay. And I got my license and registration and gave it to the officer, and he goes back to his car. Do you ever if you're ever in this situation, do you ever wonder what they do in their car? I don't think they're doing anything. I think they just go back there and they just sit there to make you sweat. And he's probably texting his friends, you ought to see this guy I just pulled over. He is so nervous. And they're just having a good laugh, and whatever he's doing back there, he's doing it. And while he's back in his car, Liam starts up again, Dad, Dad. And right now, I'm not really in a good mood. You know, I'm kind of trying to keep my calm and keep my cool. I'm a little bit frustrated because I don't want to be here. I don't want to be doing this. We were going somewhere. I think it was important. We needed to be getting there. But Liam's in the back. Dad, Dad, Dad. And I'm just like, not now, Liam, not now. Police officer comes back to the window, and he wrote me a nice little note. It was really kind. We set up an appointment to talk about it later. He gave it to me, and have a nice day, drive a little slower. And he goes back to his car, and Liam starts up again. Dad, Dad. Not now. At this point, my mind is not full of peaceful thoughts, right? I mean, even though I'm not in a lot of trouble, I'm a little bit frustrated because, and maybe you've had this experience where you're driving now after that has happened, and you're thinking to yourself, you know, I want to respect my authority, but doesn't he have better things to be doing with his time? I mean, can't he be out like chasing robbers or taking down drug dealers instead of taking these good law-abiding citizens and making them slow down? And Liam's in the back, Dad, Dad. And so finally, what, Liam? Dad, that was a community helper. Now, in that moment, I didn't really feel like that was a community helper, right? I feel like, you know, maybe he's helping someone, but it's not me. But at the same time, I very quickly realized that my 4-year-old was speaking some deep wisdom into my life. Because actually that is a community helper, and he is helping the community because I should be driving the speed limit. That's what I ought to be doing, and he's keeping the community safe by reminding me very gently of that truth. There's a reminder to me that sometimes God places authority in our lives that maybe we don't really appreciate, but we still need to have the right attitude toward. And it may not be a police officer, it may be a boss at work, it may be someone else, a coach on a team, a teacher at school, but anywhere we go in life, we deal with this question of authority. And how do we as Christ followers respond to authority? We're working our way through the book of Ephesians. And in the second half of the book, which is where we are, Paul is really giving us practical advice to teach us what it looks like for us as Christ followers to live appropriately in the world. And for the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about relationships, specifically coming from this command that Paul gives us to submit to one another, which we talked about submitting, and what that means is to trust and act upon the wisdom of someone else. And so now Paul is giving us some very specific examples of relationships where we need to do that, where we need to submit to others. Because the big idea is that every relationship is an opportunity to be formed by Jesus' Spirit. Jesus wants to shape us, to form us into the person He created us to be. He wants us to look like Him. And He does that primarily through our relationships. And so last week we talked about how that happens in the marriage relationship. And today we're going to cover two more relationships that Paul writes about in Ephesians 6. We're going to talk about the parent-child relationship, and we're going to talk about the master-slave relationship. And that's going to be a little bit tricky when we get there. But here's what I want you to see. The parent-child relationship is a God-ordained relationship. Since the beginning of time, God created this relationship as a way to ensure that from generation to generation to generation, people learned about who God is, what He expects, and how they can follow Him. So it's a God-ordained relationship. But the master-slave relationship is absolutely not a God-ordained relationship. And in fact, it's the exact opposite. It's something that's created by sinful men. And it's this societal construct that has plagued our existence since the beginning of time. And yet, in these two vastly different types of relationship, Paul says, hey, God's expectation for you is the same. You ought to respect and submit in Christ to those in authority over you. And so while we can broadly apply that principle to every relationship, if someone has authority over you as a follower of Christ, you ought to submit and honor that person. Specifically today, we're going to talk about the parent-child relationship and the master-slave relationship. And so this sermon's going to feel a little bit disjointed because I'm going to bounce from one to the next. And what we're going to do is we're going to say, what does it look like for children? What does it look like for fathers? What does it look like for slaves? What does it look like for masters? And so that's going to be a bit disjointed as we go through it. But we're going to get to the end, and I hope you'll stay with me till then. And at the end, we'll be able to tie it together with what the main principle here is. What's the takeaway that every single one of us can walk out these doors and apply in our lives every day, every hour, every minute. So that's the plan for this morning. All right, open your Bibles to Ephesians chapter 6, or you can pull it up on your phone or tablet. We'll put it up on the screen so you can follow along. And I'm going to start reading in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 1. Paul writes this, children. By the way, this is really interesting. So Ephesians is a letter. Paul wrote this letter to Christians in the city of Ephesus. And Paul is writing from a Roman prison, and so he sends this letter to the city of Ephesus. And throughout Ephesus, there are churches. They're not like this. They're groups of people meeting in houses. And so they would take Paul's letter and pass it around house to house. And everybody would say, hey, come over to the church tonight because we're going to read the letter that Paul sent. And so they would read this letter from beginning to end, and everybody would sit and listen to the wisdom of Paul. And I think it's very interesting that in this letter, Paul actually addresses children, which means he's assuming something. He's assuming that in these churches there are children there, and they are listening, and they are capable of learning and knowing who God is and knowing how to follow Him. And if that's Paul's assumption, that should be our assumption. And so that's one of the reasons that here at the gathering, we make a lot of big investments in our young people. Because we believe that our children can know who God is. They can know what He has done for them. They can know how much He loves them. And they can follow Him. And so we make every effort to make sure that our kids know that. Whether they be 3 years old or 18 years old, we want them to know God loves them, God has a plan for them, and Jesus died for them and wants them to follow Him. So we make those investments here at the gathering. And I'll just make a sales pitch on the side here. If you want to invest your time in a really worthwhile pursuit, sign up for kids ministry. An hour once a month is a way for you to invest in the next generation and point them to Jesus. There's not a lot better ways that you can spend an hour. So write it on your connection card, stop by the kids area, volunteer to work once a month. It will be one of the best investments you can make. All right, back to Ephesians. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth. When Paul talks about children here, he's talking about dependence. Right? So in the Roman world, a child was anyone who is still dependent on their parents. So if they're living in their parents' house, even if they're 25, they're still a dependent. And Paul is saying this: if you're dependent, you're obedient. That's the standard. If you're dependent, you're obedient. And then he uses this phrase, honor your father and mother that your days will be long. And he's actually drawing this from all different parts of the Bible. Moses said this in the law. Solomon said it in Proverbs. David said it in Psalms. Jesus said this, and now Paul is saying it. And so this is one of these timeless principles. Honor your father and mother that your days will be long. And the reason this works is because parents know what's better for their children than children do. Let me explain it this way. We read this and say, honor your father and mother that your days may be long. And we might look at that and say, well, is that really true all the time? Because isn't it possible that someone could obey their parents and have a short life? And of course that's true, and we know it's true. But we have to read this as wisdom literature because that's what it is. He's quoting this from the Old Testament in wisdom literature. So whenever you read Proverbs, what you're looking at is statements that are generally true, which should be followed in life. And so it's generally true that the children who obey their parents, who honor their parents, live longer. And the reason is because children on their own do foolish things. And so their parents teach them how not to be foolish. Kids run out in the road on their own, and parents teach them, don't run out in the road. Children eat anything they see, and there are some things they shouldn't eat. And parents teach them, don't eat this, don't put this in your mouth. I was a youth pastor for about 10 years, and one of the trips we took was this trip called Survivor. We would go to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and it was a lot like the television show. We would have to survive. The kids would all stay outside. They'd have to create tents out of tarps. They didn't get to eat very much. They had to have just really sparse things. Sometimes they had to find their food. But it was a way for them to get away from the world and really just focus on what's super important. And one year we were up there on Survivor, and we had 2 straight days of thunderstorms and rain. And so the kids were soaked, and they had tents that didn't really keep the rain out. And so their campsites were soaked. They couldn't get fires going, and they were miserable, and I had mercy on them. And so I called a local church, and I said, hey, here's the situation. I'm a youth pastor. We're up here. We're doing this event. I just need a dry place for the kids to sleep for one night. Could we come and sleep at your church? And they were very gracious and said, yeah, absolutely. And so we loaded all the kids into the vans and drove them to the church, and we got there. And on the way into the church, the kids noticed that just 2 blocks from the church was a Pizza Hut. And so, of course, they didn't, David, can we go to Pizza Hut? No, that's not the point of this trip. We're trying to get rid of all that kind of stuff. But I could hear the talking. And I know kids. And I knew that some of them were talking about sneaking out and running down to Pizza Hut. And so I had to put my foot down. I said, guys, listen, I want you all to understand something. Nobody leaves the church building, not for any reason. If you take one step outside of the building, I'm calling your parents, I'm driving you to the Greyhound station, and I'm sending you home. And they knew I was serious because I just didn't bluff. And so they're like, okay, we can't do that. Of course, there's always that one kid, right? His name is Paul Carter, and Paul raises his hand. Hey, Dave, we can't leave the church for any reason at all? No reason at all, Paul. What if we're on fire? I said, nope. If you're on fire, you still can't leave the church. Well, Paul liked to push the rules. So do you know what Paul did? You do, don't you? He set himself on fire. He took his lighter and he lit his jeans on fire. And so he's got this flame going up his leg, and everybody's like, Pastor Dave, Paul's on fire. And Paul says, can I go outside now? And I said, nope, you better put it out. Because, kids do foolish things. And they actually need their parents to correct them and show them the right way. See, this is God's plan, is that parents shape their kids. Parents form their kids to look like Jesus. And so that if you're in a relationship where you have someone like a parent in authority over you that can speak wisdom into your life and help shape you and help form you like Jesus, Paul says, obey them. They know what's good for you. Your life will be longer if you listen. Jesus shapes children through their parents. And because that's true, he continues on in this passage by now addressing fathers. So in verse 4, he says this, fathers, and by the way, this is good for mothers too, but I think you'll understand as we get deeper into the verse why Paul is specifically addressing fathers. He says, fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. Dads, do not exasperate or discourage or frustrate your children. The calling for a father is to form their child, to shape their child, to help their child look like Jesus. And Paul says, if you're exasperating your kid, if you're frustrating your kid, if you're discouraging your kid, you're not making them look like Jesus. So how do fathers do that? I think sometimes we can do that just with the tone of our voice. If you're a father and you're always speaking to your children in an angry voice and an aggressive voice, and that's all they ever hear from you, they're going to be exasperated. Our kids need to hear from their fathers in a voice that is calming and soothing, that helps them to know that, hey, everything is okay. Sometimes, and I hate this part, sometimes fathers exasperate their children through violence. I hate the fact that some fathers think the way to get their kids to do what they ought to do is by hurting them. There is never a time and there is never a place to injure your children. Sometimes fathers exasperate their children because they don't show them love and affection with their words, with their actions. Dads, your kids need to hear you say, I love you. They need to hear you say, I'm proud of you. They need to hear you say, you're working so hard and I think it's so great that you're getting after this. They need to hear you say, I'm sorry. They need to hear you say, I'm wrong. And if they never hear any of those words, they'll be frustrated. Even more, your kids need to be touched and loved by you. You need to hug them. Kids need to know that their dads are fine with hugging them, that their dads love to hug them and say, I love you, and wrap your arms around. Even when your kids are messing up, that's when you need to hug them. You know, you really messed up here, but I still love you. You really messed up here, but I forgive you. And it's okay. And I know that some of you are sitting here right now, and you're hearing me say this, and you're thinking to yourself, yeah, I didn't get that from my dad. And it frustrated me. And it discouraged me. And it exasperated me. And so I beg with you and I plead with you, don't do that to your kids. Sometimes as fathers, we can exasperate our kids by living our dreams through them. I think fathers do this a lot more than mothers do. We have this tendency to push our kids and decide we know what's best for them and we know what they should do, and we're just going to push them because we want them to accomplish what we never did. And we look back on our life and say, I was so close here, so I'm going to push my kid till they can accomplish this. Or we look back and say, I wish I had done this, so I'm going to push my kid until they do this. And we push so hard and so often that we exasperate them and we frustrate them. 2 weekends ago, Mary Ann and I went up to Michigan for a funeral. And funerals are never fun. This was a really bad one. Shane was a 37-year-old dad, and he left behind a teenage girl and his wife. He was in a car accident. And Shane was a kid from our youth group when I was a youth pastor. And Shane's sisters babysat our kids the whole time they were growing up. And his younger brother was in our youth group, and Shane's wife was in our youth group, and Shane's wife's sisters were in our youth group, and Shane's wife's brother was in our youth group. And so this was one of those things where we're there with these families that we invested a whole bunch of our life in, and it's this terrible, sad, awful moment. When we heard that Shane had died, our very first thought was for his parents, Brian and Cindy. Because Mary Ann and I always agreed that Brian and Cindy were the absolute best parents we knew. And as youth pastor and having young kids ourselves, we always said, if we could be half the parents that Brian and Cindy are, we'll be a success. And if the world looked at Brian and Cindy, they never would have said these are really successful people. Neither of them had really glamorous jobs. Neither of them rose to high positions in their careers. They had a good house for their kids, but it was nothing special. They drove old cars. There was nothing about Brian and Cindy that would make you say, man, those are some high-powered, successful people. But let me tell you, if you saw their kids, you would say, those are some great parents. And that was on display at the funeral. As sibling after sibling got up to talk about their brother and talk about their parents and talk about their life, and it was just so clear that they had made the right investments. And then Brian got up and talked and said, the last time I saw Shane was the day he died, and he stopped by our house after work. Just think about that for a minute. 37-year-old guy just stopping by his dad's house after work just to say hi to his dad. They talked about work a little bit, and Brian said, and Shane said, I got to go. And so I said, Shane, I love you so much. And Shane said, Dad, I love you so much. And then he left, and that was our last conversation. I don't ever want to have a last conversation with my son or with my daughter. But if I do, I hope that's it. And Shane's life was way too short, but as people talked about who he was and what he did in his life, it was clear that this was a guy that touched so many people, and I believe it was because his father invested into him. And his father did not exasperate him or discourage him or frustrate him. Brian chose, I'm not going to worry about chasing a career. I'm not going to worry about chasing hobbies. I'm not going to worry about any of this other stuff. I am going to devote my life to my kids, and that paid great dividends. And this is what Paul is saying to us as parents. He's saying you need to submit yourself to your children in this way. Make them your primary investment. Set aside what you think you want. Set aside what you think you need. There will be time for that. But while those kids are there with you, invest yourself in them because you are the God-given formative influence in their life. God gave you those children so that you could shape them to look like Jesus. Every relationship is an opportunity to be shaped by Jesus. And the truth is that as we try to shape our children, they will shape us. Hey, Dad, that was a community helper. My 4-year-old son shaping me a little bit to look more like Jesus. So Paul says in the house, in the home, parents, children, submit to one another, be formed by Jesus. And then he moves into the last example of these relationships, and it's the tough one to deal with. It's the master-slave relationship. In Ephesians 6, verse 6, he says, slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear. Now, how do we talk about this? Right? This is tough because we read a passage like this and we see Paul talking about slavery, and what do we want him to say? What we want Paul to say is, hey, slavery is wrong. Stop it. Eliminate it. Eradicate it. Get rid of it. And yet he doesn't say that. And you read through the entire Bible and you keep looking for this, don't you? Because the Bible talks about slavery in the Old Testament, the New Testament, and everywhere it talks about slavery, you want it to say, slavery is wrong, get rid of it, eradicate it. And it never says that. So does that mean that the Bible's okay with slavery? Does that mean that God is okay with slavery? No. It doesn't mean that. Remember that every human is created in the image of God. That's our base assumption from Genesis chapter 1. Every human is created in the image of God. And it is never okay for one human to abuse another human, ever. So why doesn't Paul address it that way? Well, I can give you a couple of reasons, and they're not completely satisfactory, but stay with me and I think you'll get it. First of all, Paul was living in a time when he could not possibly imagine a world without slavery. Right? In the Roman Empire, there were millions and millions of slaves. This is a different kind of slavery. This isn't necessarily slavery based on ethnicity or race. It's slavery based on finances. Like people would choose to sell themselves into slavery because they couldn't afford to live. Sometimes it was slavery based on one country being conquered by another, and they would carry off captives and they would become slaves. And so there were a lot of different reasons why slavery existed, but the truth was, everywhere you went in the world, there was slavery. There were no known civilizations where slavery didn't exist. And so for Paul, it was hard to even envision a world without slavery. And as such, his focus was less on changing the whole world and more on changing the hearts of the people he encountered. And so Paul wasn't really out to make great societal change or great political change. He was out to change the hearts of individuals. And so when you read Paul's letters to churches, you have to understand that's his goal. I want to change the hearts of people. And here's the harsh reality. He lived in a world where half the population was enslaved. And so Paul's desire was to reach out to those who were enslaved and to reach out to those who were enslaving them. Tell them about Jesus and change their hearts. So if you were a slave and you were following Jesus, Paul's desire was that you would know how to best follow Jesus as a slave. And if you were a slave owner and you were following Jesus, Paul's desire was that you would know best how to follow Jesus as a slave owner. If you look at the book of Philemon, which is a really short book in the New Testament, here's where you really see Paul's heart on this matter. Philemon was a slave owner, and he was a Christian. He was a leader in his church. We don't know what kind of slave owner he was. We assume and we hope that he was a generous, kind, gracious master that took care of his slaves. But we know that he had one slave named Onesimus. And Onesimus didn't like being a slave, and so he ran away. That was a capital crime. If he was captured, then Philemon had the right and the authority to put him to death. And Onesimus ran to Rome. That's where Paul was. And somehow Onesimus and Paul came to know each other, and Paul already knew Philemon. And as Paul and Onesimus talked, Onesimus began to believe in Jesus. And he made Jesus his Savior. He made a decision to follow Jesus with all of his life. And so Paul said, Onesimus, what you need to do is you need to make things right with Philemon. Because what you did was against the law, and you need to go back and you need to deal with this and make this right. But I'm not going to send you back on your own. I'm going to send you with a letter. And so Paul writes this letter to Philemon, the slave owner, about Onesimus, the slave. And if you read it, it's great. Paul's actually kind of a little bit passive-aggressive here. He says to Philemon, Philemon, I'm not going to tell you what to do because I believe you're going to do the right thing. In fact, I know you're going to do the right thing because you love Jesus and I love Jesus, so I'm certain you'll do the right thing. And then he says this, when Onesimus arrives, I want you to greet him no longer as a slave, but as a brother. You see what Paul's doing here? Paul realizes he can't change the Roman Empire. He can't change the fact that half of the population is enslaved. But what he can do is he can change the hearts of individuals. And so to Philemon, who he has a relationship with, he says, hey, Onesimus is no longer your slave. He's your brother. That's the heart of Jesus. That's the heart of God. God's heart is never that any human being abuse another human being. But when you live in a sinful world where people reject, they reject the rule of God and they reject the love of God, bad things are going to happen and bad people are going to do bad things. And so we as Christ followers must do everything that we can to build relationships, to build bridges, and where we can change people's hearts, we change people's hearts. That's what Paul does. So here in Ephesians 6, Paul writes to slaves. He says, look, this is not the ideal situation. This is not God's plan. This is not God's desire that you be here, and yet you are here. So while you are here, here's what you do as a Christ follower. That's the context of Ephesians 6. This is what Paul writes to the slaves. Slaves, Obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly, as if you were serving the Lord, not people, because you know that the Lord will reward each one of you for whatever good they do, whether they are slave or free. Paul says, hey, look, if you find yourself in a situation where you're enslaved, you need to respect your master. You need to honor your master. It says, honor him in Christ. And what that means is listen to him as you would listen to Christ. Now, it's hard for us to apply this, isn't it? Because this isn't our world anymore. And yet I think there's a really obvious application for each of us, and it's this. All of us serve somebody. Many of us have a boss at work. We have a manager that we need to listen to. Or maybe there's another relationship in your life, teacher, student, that you have to listen to and obey someone else. And here's what Paul is saying to you. Work as if you were working for Jesus. You see, if you were working for Jesus, you would be the most honest employee ever, wouldn't you? If you were working for Jesus, you would be the most trustworthy and reliable and hardworking employee ever. If Jesus came to you and said, hey, we're really running behind here and I need you to stay late, can you do that? If Jesus asked you to do that, what would you say? Yeah, man, for Jesus, I'd do anything. That's what Paul is saying. If you're in a relationship where you serve someone else, work as if you are working for Jesus. By the way, just as an aside, this would open incredible doors for you to talk about Jesus, wouldn't it? You'd be the employee of the month every month if you worked like you were working for Jesus. And people would want to know, what is it about this person? No, nothing gets them down. They always work hard. They always do their job. They're honorable. They're trustworthy. They're a great coworker. What's going on here? You just say, man, I work as if I'm working for Jesus because Jesus has done so much for me. Paul says work as if you're working for Jesus. But he doesn't end there, does he? He says, now there's another side to this relationship. There's the master. And he says to the master in verse 9, and masters, treat your slaves in the same way. So if the slave is to work as if they are working for Jesus, now the master is to treat their slaves as if their slaves are Jesus. He says, do not threaten them. And read into that everything you can, because it's what Paul intends. Do not abuse them. Do not mistreat them. Do not overwork them. He's saying, look, if you're a master in Rome, and you have this slave, and that's the economy, in some situations, a master can't just release his slaves because they've got nowhere to go. They've got nothing to do. The master gives them a home. He gives them a food. He gives them clothes. He takes care of their children. So he says, look, if you're a master and in this economy you can't release all of your slaves, treat them like you would treat Jesus. Take care of them. Be kind to them. Treat them as a brother. Treat them as a sister. And if we're going to apply this to ourselves today, we see the same applies. If you're the manager, if you're the boss, if you're a leader, in any way you get to lead people, Paul says this to you: lead as if you were leading Jesus. Man, does that change the way you treat other people? Don't be a jerk. Listen. Speak as Jesus would speak to them. Speak as if they were Jesus. If you have to give negative feedback to an employee, imagine that you're talking to Jesus. Would that make it a more loving conversation? You see, in all of this, whether we're talking about the husband-wife relationship, the parent-child relationship, the boss-employee relationship, the master-slave relationship, the teacher-student relationship, any relationship, here's what Paul is saying to us. Okay, this is the big idea. Include Jesus in your relationships. Include Jesus in your relationships. And what that means is that I ask myself the question, how would Jesus treat this person? Everyone I encounter, how would Jesus treat this person? Graciously, with kindness, joy, patience, mercy, grace. And then I asked myself a second question. How would I treat this person if this person was Jesus? I think that's the tougher one. And that's the one that's been challenging me all week, is that every single person I interact with, I need to ask myself, how would I interact differently with this person if that was Jesus? Now, I get it. This is not always easy. Some people it's easy to do this with, right? Because there are some people who it's just a joy to be around them. But there are some people who are jerks. They are no fun to be around. They are ornery. They are negative. They are abusive. You name it, you don't want to be around them. And it's awful tough to think about how can I treat them like Jesus would treat them. And that's when I remember what Jesus did for me. Remember what Jesus did? He went to the cross. And it was after he was beaten and abused. And it was after he was tried unjustly in the courts. And it was after he was dragged through the streets of Jerusalem with the cross on his back. And it was after they laid him on that cross and put nails in his hands and feet. And it was after they dropped the cross in the ground. And it was after he was up there suffocating to death. And it was after they were gambling for his clothes and spitting on him and mocking him. And after all of that, he said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And if Jesus could say that and do that for those people who had done what they had done, what is it that I'm not willing to forgive? What is it that I'm not willing to let go of? Jesus went through all of that so he could include me in eternity. And he asks me to simply include him in every relationship. Let's pray. Father, thank you for Jesus and for your plan of salvation. Thank you for drawing us to yourself. Thank you for our families. Thank you for our friends. Thank you for all of those around us who have such a positive influence on us. And help us to be people who have that same influence on others. I pray that this morning, as we think about the relationships that we have, that we'll find the ways to include you in each of those relationships. That because we are bringing Jesus into relationships, I pray that more people will see you, will want to follow you, will love you. Help us to be a shining light in our community as to what the love of Jesus can do for everyone around us. Thank you for this church where we can be inspired to go out and live for you. In your name, amen.